Hi all, this is Martin Lee Patterson and I'm a first year applied linguistics student in Swansea University. I'm coming to you with an interview with Joe Seaton, who works at the university. Could you introduce yourself, Joe?
Hello, Martin. Yes, good to see you. Hello, everyone. I'm a tutor at Swansea University at present, teaching on undergrad and postgrad modules associated with linguistics, teacher training, etc. And it's nice to be here with you today.
Today we were hoping to talk about your experience teaching in remote and hostile environments, right? So can you tell us a little bit about your background as a teacher and teacher trainer?
I did my teacher training qualification, a Cert TESOL, similar to a CELTA, in 1999 in London. And then I taught on a summer school in the UK. That was my first teaching experience. And then I went and worked in Lisbon in Portugal for a couple of years, which was a great introduction to teaching. And then after that, I came back to Wales, actually to Swansea University, and was a teacher of academic English for a long time in the university. And during that time, I also got the opportunity to do a master's in English language teaching, and also became trained up as a teacher trainer. And so that's when my interest and experience of teacher training really started. And then after a period of working at Swansea Uni, I then went abroad, overseas again, to a number of countries, some more remote countries, working more as a teacher trainer around the world, and had some very interesting experiences doing that.
When you started, did you intend to be working in potentially hostile environments, or is that something that caught your interest later on?
A bit later on, I initially was interested in exploring Europe and just seeing where the world took me and where the wind took me, so to speak. But gradually I became a bit more interested in global affairs, and I studied international relations while I was at Swansea Uni. And I became more interested in remote and hostile environments. I took a job in Bali, Indonesia, for a school there as a teacher trainer. And part of that role, they sent me to island nations across Indonesia, including Java, Lombok, Sulawesi, to some quite remote places to work on the ELTIS program, English language teaching in Islamic schools. And that was quite interesting. That was my first experience of going to some more remote places where they've got more basic resources. And it's interesting, the places which are more remote and have the more basic resources are where you often find people are really passionate about learning and really enthusiastic to develop their English skills and their teaching skills. So this was a great first introduction to more remote and basic teaching environments. And then while I was still employed in Indonesia, I was given the opportunity to work in Kiribati. It's a small island nation in the Pacific. It's very remote, very basic, and AusAid were funding a English language and education development program there. Because the island is very low lying, it's only 3 meters at its highest point. And with the continuing rise in sea levels, it's feared that the islands could sink, and there might be a need to repatriate all the islanders. So there was a KELP program, Kiribati English Language Program, to try to upgrade the language level of the islanders so that if they needed to be moved to another location, for example, New Zealand, they would have the English skills required when they got there. So I worked for 6 months in Kiribati in the Pacific, and this was a very interesting eye-opener in terms of teaching in a remote environment where their access to teaching materials, their access to education is very different than what we're familiar with in the West and in other more developed places. So that was a good first introduction to that sort of world.
And when you talk about remote environments and hostile environments, what exactly does that mean to you?
Well, when I say remote, it just means far away from anywhere else physically, but perhaps also removed from access to education in the same way that we take access to education for granted in the UK, or I certainly always used to. I remember when I've been in Kiribati a couple of weeks, and there was a classroom game, some classroom materials which referred to McDonald's. I should have checked my materials more carefully before going into class, I must admit. But when the McDonald's card came up, the student, there were adults in a teacher training program, and the adult student who turned over that card, I remember him saying to me, "What's this? What's McDonald's?" And I'd sort of taken for granted that everyone has some shared common knowledge. But because Kiribati is such a remote island nation, both in its geography and also in terms of the access to information and education. Some things which we just are assumed knowledge in the West, people haven't yet heard about. So that's an example of how remote Kiribati is.
So
Hostile environment is a different thing again. That's an environment where there's more of a threat, perhaps due to civil war or conflict within the location. And I went on to work after the remote environment. I went on to work in a few conflict or hostile environments, which was, again, very interesting in a different way.
So have you found that the resources for training as a teacher of English, have you found that they're potentially not well suited to these sorts of situations? Or
I mean, on the whole, you know, you can adapt your materials, and that was part of my role when working in Kiribati, was to adapt some. I was curriculum manager there, and part of the role was focused on adapting materials made by, it wasn't Headway, but it was a major coursebook provider, adapting it to more suit the islands and the islanders, so adapting it to the local context. And I think generally you can adapt materials to a context. I think, you know, the rise in the availability of digital materials is a great thing, but in remote environments or hostile environments, often you can't rely on the success of digital materials, because there might not be the hardware, there might not be the computers, or there might not be the internet connection or the Wi-Fi or whatever it is you need. So I'm also interested, apart from remote environments, in the idea of teaching in low resource environments, and they often go hand in hand, and there were very limited resources in Kiribati, and for example when I went to Sulawesi, there as well, limited resources. Yeah.
So your experience in these places, it's kind of been like working with low resources and working with trying to adapt your materials to match different cultural conditions and different access to potentially cultural touchstones that you might have thought would have been obvious to another audience.
Yeah, that's a great point about the cultural touchstones, actually, because often when you're in class, a course book might refer to a famous person, like, I don't know, Barack Obama or David Beckham or something like that. Someone you'd think, oh, everyone will know who this person is. But it was interesting when I was working in the Pacific in Kiribati, the amount of famous people that you could rely on to say, oh, for example, this person was much more limited. And that was an interesting one. And there's no need for learners or educators or students to know famous people. It's just, it can sometimes be useful in a learning context or a role play or something like that to pick famous people. But you're absolutely right, the same cultural touchstones weren't necessarily available.
So what would you say that your biggest takeaway from doing all this has been, like, as an educator or as somebody who's like visiting all these different places?
That's a great question. That question wasn't on the list. I wasn't ready for it. Yeah, it's interesting. My biggest takeaway, one, is to, you know, when I grew up in the UK, I pretty much took education for granted. It was available to all, and it was a pain in the neck going to school. And I've realised how much people around the world are so desperate for and grateful for education, and the massive difference that teachers and teacher trainers can make in terms of helping other people improve their own lives and progress to where they want to go, help them in the path they're making in trying to progress to get the job they want, or live in the country they want, or get the IELTS score they want, or whatever it is. So the thing I've learned is how much people can value the work you do in terms of teaching them or teacher training, and how much it can benefit them. And also, you know, working in South Sudan and working in Afghanistan, which aren't necessarily remote, but they're hostile environments where conflict and civil war is having a massive impact on the everyday lives of people and their security and safety on a daily basis. And again, security and safety is something that I always took for granted as someone growing up in the UK, but that's not something people take for granted in South Sudan or Afghanistan, and it's a different world. And the ability, you know, if I want to go down to the shop and buy a newspaper or a pint of milk, it's very simple, I can do that. But I worked in Afghanistan for a long time, nearly 4 years, and I couldn't just pop out of the house and nip to the shop, because I wasn't allowed off the embassy compound unless I was in an armoured vehicle with a team of bodyguards, and unless I was wearing body armour, because the security situation was so intense. So, you know, another thing I appreciate is my freedom and my security, and also the world around me, to be honest, because in the Afghanistan situation, I was surrounded a lot of time by blast walls and concrete and security type infrastructure. And so that's made me realize how beautiful parts of the UK are and the natural world. But the single biggest thing is absolutely realizing the benefit that you can bring to other people's lives, whether you're a teacher or a teacher trainer or any sort of educator. And the small things that you might not realize how much you're benefiting your learners, but that certainly I realized more and more that people were so grateful and crying out for these education opportunities to better enable themselves or to pass that exam, get that qualification, get that visa, get onto that university course, understand the commentary in a football match or whatever it is that they're interested in. Yeah.
I think that's all we have time for in this first interview, but we'll be discussing the matter of teaching in Afghanistan in particular more in the second interview, which will also be going up on our channel. So thank you, Joe, for your insight about teaching overseas in remote environments, and I'll be speaking to you again in a minute.